or in the far distant future. They hypocritically give lip service to Jesus, but they refrain from doing the will of the Father. It is left to then the comparatively smaller group known as Jehovah's Witnesses to declare good news of good things of God's kingdom purposes to the extremities of the inhabited earth. Now, more than ever, we know this is being done. We see it every time in our broadcasts, the monthly broadcasts. And even here locally, we see the growth. All who claim to have a relationship with Jesus Christ without doing kingdom works and putting on that truly Christ-like personality will fare badly when he executes divine vengeance against his present system of things. Then Jesus will confess or make publicly manifest that he never knew those whose Christianity was no deeper than lip service. Never did the many so-called powerful works in which they boast fool the Son of God, rather than displaying righteousness in actuality, they prove to be, as Jesus said, workers of lawlessness. Hence, when Jesus acts as God's executioner at the coming great tribulation, he will declare to them, "Get away from me." Those imitation Christians will be denied entrance into the eternal blessings of God's kingdom. So then more is required than just saying the words. Our actions are involved. We need to examine our own position. We need to be sure that we really are doing the will of our Heavenly Father to succeed in getting life when the kingdom takes over here on the earth. We must cultivate the qualities that God approves. And we can review some of these in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 9. It's Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 9. Happy are those conscious of their spiritual need, since the kingdom of the heavens belongs to them. Happy are those who mourn, since they will be comforted. Happy are the mild-tempered, since they will inherit the earth. Happy are those hungering and thirsting for righteousness, since they will be filled. Happy are the merciful, since they will be shown mercy. Happy are the pure in heart, since they will see God. Happy are the peacemakers, since they will be called sons of God. Yes, God views favorably those who are conscious of spiritual need, mild-tempered, hungry for righteousness, merciful, pure in heart, peacemakers. Thus, happiness results from cultivating these qualities. To get into the kingdom, one must have deep regard for God's law. In ancient times, as long as the law given by God through Moses was in effect, the Jewish followers were to practice it and advocate obedience to it. We must not be like the first man, Adam. We do not want to willfully disobey in any matter, big or small. Neither must we be as the self-righteous Pharisees, spiritual leaders in Jesus' time, who had their own brand of righteousness. And we certainly do not want to follow the world's way of thinking as to what is right and what is wrong, which is constantly changing to satisfy people's selfish desires and leaving what God requires totally out of the picture. No, we want to follow Jesus' example. He had the highest regard for God's law and encourages others to have such as well. In fact, let's note what he says in Matthew chapter 5, the first part of verse 19. It's Matthew chapter 5, the first part of verse 19. Whoever therefore breaks one of these least commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in relation to the kingdom of the heavens. Now, a person might break one of the commandments by willfully disobeying it, or in this case, he might do what was viewed as even worse, namely, teaching fellow Jews subject to the law that some of its commands were not binding. They didn't have to obey that law. But while the law covenant was in force, it was an expression of God's will for his people. Transgression or teaching things contrary to the commandments that some may have viewed as even least in importance would be apostasy against God. The law was given to lead the Israelites to the Messiah, who would be the principal ruler of God's kingdom. Hence, as far as getting into the kingdom was concerned, then, persons who broke God's commands would be called least. They may not enter into the kingdom. Also, we do not merely obey the letter of the law. We must get the spirit of it and act in harmony with it. For example, let's take into consideration Matthew chapter 5. There now, verse 21. You heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you must not murder, but whoever commits a murder will be accountable to the court of justice. So far from disregarding God's law, Jesus condemns even the steady attitude that may contribute to breaking it. Let's continue with the first part of verse 22. However, I say to you that everyone who continues wrathful with his brother will be accountable to the court of justice. Thus we can see how the attitude is involved. Because though a murder has not taken place, continuing wrathful with an associate is still serious, and there will be accountability for that. Now, besides doing what is right, we need to learn to love what is right. And for this, let's look to Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. You heard that it was said, you must not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who keeps on looking at a woman so as to have a passion for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Turning attention to the seventh of the Ten Commandments, he not only mentions the command, but Jesus helps us to appreciate the principle of it by condemning even that steady attitude toward adultery. When he makes mention of keeps on looking, Jesus is not talking about a passing immoral thought, but such continued looking which arouses passionate desire, and which, if opportunity affords, may result in adultery. Thus, the Bible urges us to safeguard the heart. Jehovah wants only willing subjects, those that prefer his ways. Therefore, it is important to learn to imitate God in showing love. And that's all it was about at our recent convention. And let's read about the type of love Jesus mentions in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. You heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. However, I say to you, continue to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you, so that you may prove yourselves sons of your Father who is in the heavens, since he makes his sun rise on both the wicked and the good, and makes it rain on both the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those loving you, what reward do you have? Are not also the tax collectors doing the same thing? And if you greet your brothers only, what extraordinary thing are you doing? Are not also the people of the nations doing the same thing? You must accordingly be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. So this kind of love is not stifled by pride when others are unappreciative, but seeks the lasting welfare of others, even those who act like enemies. Also, Jesus clearly showed how the Mosaic law was weakened by rabbinic tradition. There in verse 43 and 44, you heard that it was said, you must love your neighbor and hate your enemy. However, I say to you, continue to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. The written Mosaic law put no limits on love. You must love your fellow as yourself. It was the Pharisees who balked at this commandment, and to escape it, they limited the term neighbor to those who kept to the traditions. So it was that when Jesus later, he reminded a certain lawyer of the command to love your neighbor as yourself, well, then the man questioned, who's my neighbor? Jesus answered with the illustration of the Good Samaritan. Make yourself a neighbor to the one that needs you. Continuing his sermon, Jesus proclaimed that God showed love to the wicked. He causes the sun and the rain to pour out on both. There's nothing extraordinary in loving those who love you. The wicked do that, as was mentioned. Prove yourselves sons of God. Copy him. Make yourself a neighbor to all and love your neighbor. Jesus concludes this portion of his sermon by admonishing to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect.